vicious, calculated attack on a 7-year-old boy, so brutal that staff who witnessed it
Prince Louis ran weeping through the halls of Balmoral after a member of Queen Camilla's inner circle directed a venomous remark at the 7-year-old. Prince William didn't shout or ask for an apology. Within hours, the Prince of Wales used his authority to permanently strip Camilla's family of their palace access. That single swift purge triggered an explosive power struggle at the highest level of the British monarchy. A summer afternoon at Balmoral that degenerated into chaos. A small wooden toy boat hit the stone tiles of the Balmoral Castle terrace with a sharp crack. Prince Louis dropped it, turned on his heel, and ran. He did not look back. His shoes skidded on the polished floorboards of the main hallway as he darted past 2 footmen standing near the glass doors. His face was red, tears were running down his cheeks. It was late August, just after 4 in the afternoon. The afternoon sun sat low over the Scottish hills, casting long shadows across the estate lawn. Outside on the west veranda, tea service was still laid out. Silver pots sat on linen tablecloths. Plats of scones remained half-eaten. A small group of guests stood near the stone balustrade, laughing quietly among themselves. The guests were not official working royals. They were personal relations invited for the weekend by Queen Camilla. Her son, Tom Parker Bowles, had brought extended family members and close acquaintances up to Scotland. They had spent the morning walking the grounds. By afternoon, they were relaxing on the terrace, taking advantage of the warm weather. Louis had been playing near the garden fountain just 10 feet away from the adult seating area. He was sailing his toy boat in the shallow stone basin. It was a simple, quiet scene. Then one of Camilla's guests walked over to the water. The individual looked down at the child. They did not offer a polite hello. Instead, they delivered a sharp, pointed comment directed straight at the young prince. The words were quiet, but the tone was dismissive. The guest mocked Louis's place in the family line, comparing his public behavior at recent events to that of Camilla's own grandchildren. They told the boy he was making a scene, just like he always did on camera, and that real royal children knew how to sit still. The words landed instantly. Louis froze. He looked up, dropped his boat, and bolted toward the safety of the residence. Princess Catherine was coming down the main corridor toward the garden doors when Louis ran past her. She stopped him instantly. She dropped to one knee on the hard floor and pulled her 7-year-old son close. The boy was breathing fast, trying to speak between heavy sobs. Catherine did not raise her voice. She did not march out onto the veranda to make a scene in front of the guests. She wiped her son's eyes and listened. Louis repeated the exact phrase used against him near the fountain, word for word. The comment targeted his age, his personality, and his standing within the house. Catherine took Louis by the hand. She walked him up the grand staircase, straight past the portrait gallery, and directly into the private study of Prince William. William was sitting at his writing desk, reviewing estate paperwork, when the door opened. He looked up, saw his son's tear-stained face, and set his pen down on the blotter. Catherine explained what had just happened outside on the lawn. She laid out the timeline, the location, and the specific remark uttered by the guest. The room was silent for 3 seconds. William stood up from his chair. He walked over to Louis, bent down, and spoke softly to his son. He assured the young prince that he had done nothing wrong. Once Louis was settled with a staff member in the adjoining nursery, William turned back to Catherine. His face was completely motionless. He did not slam his fists on the table. He did not yell down the hallway, but the shift in his posture was absolute. For months, tensions had been quietly building inside the household. The presence of non-working relations on sovereign property had become a growing point of friction between the family factions. William had tolerated the expanding guest lists for the sake of his father's comfort during his ongoing health recovery. He had overlooked the casual use of staff, the private cars booked at short notice, and the growing sense of entitlement shown by outside guests staying in private lodges. That tolerance ended near the garden fountain. William walked out of his study and headed down the service corridor toward the south wing of the estate. He was not looking for Camilla's guests. He was heading straight for the private office of King Charles. The afternoon tea on the terrace continued outside, as if nothing had happened. Guests were still pouring cups from the silver tea service. Plates were being cleared by waiting staff. Down the hall, behind 2 heavy wooden doors, the Prince of Wales was about to deliver a demand that would shatter the peaceful summer retreat completely. The cold confrontation at Balmoral that rewrote royal power. A small wooden toy boat hit the terrace tiles at Balmoral Castle with a sharp crack. Prince Louis dropped it, turned, and ran. Tears ran down his face as he skidded past two footmen into the main hall. It was late August, just after 4 in the afternoon. On the west veranda, tea service was laid out. A group of guests stood near the stone balustrade, laughing quietly. They were personal relations invited for the weekend by Queen Camilla. Her son, Tom Parker Bowles, had brought extended family up to Scotland. Louis had been sailing his toy boat in the shallow fountain basin. Then one of Camilla's guests walked over. The guest did not offer a polite hello. Instead, they delivered a sharp comment directed straight at the 7-year-old prince. They mocked Louis's place in the family line, comparing his public behavior at recent events to Camilla's own grandchildren. They told the boy he was making a scene, and that real royal children knew how to sit still. Louis froze, dropped his boat, and bolted. Princess Catherine was coming down the corridor when Louis ran past. She dropped to one knee and pulled her son close. Louis repeated the exact phrase used against him near the fountain. Catherine took him by the hand and walked straight to the private study of Prince William. William listened as Catherine laid out the timeline and the specific remark. Once Louis was settled with a staff member, William stood up. His face was motionless, but his posture was absolute. For months, non-working relations on sovereign property had been a growing point of friction. William had tolerated expanding guest lists for his father's comfort during his health recovery. That tolerance ended at the garden fountain. William walked down the service corridor to the office of King Charles. He opened the heavy oak door without knocking. King Charles looked up from his red dispatch boxes, adjusting his reading glasses. William walked to the mahogany desk, placed his hands flat on the wood, and laid out what had occurred. Charles sat in silence, the color draining from his face. His immediate reaction was defensive. He suggested it might have been a harmless joke taken out of context, asking if William was sure the boy had not simply misunderstood. That was a massive mistake. William leaned in, his tone razor sharp. He reminded the king that sovereign grounds were meant to be a sanctuary for his family, not a playground for extended relations. William brought up his mother, Princess Diana, referencing the toxic palace environment of the early 1990s. He made it clear he would never allow his own children to endure that same strain. William delivered an ultimatum: 24 hours. The guest had to be off the estate before sunrise. Furthermore, a total overhaul of the private guest list for all royal residences, including Sandringham and Windsor Castle, had to begin immediately. If the king refused, William stated he would pack up his family and leave Balmoral before breakfast, making their departure very public. Before Charles could answer, the door opened. Queen Camilla stepped inside. She attempted to frame the incident as a minor misunderstanding between adults and children. William turned to face her, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Over 6 months, he had tracked the growing footprint of Camilla's extended family across royal properties. The document detailed private security clearances, private helicopter flights logged at taxpayer expense, and access granted to historical quarters in Kensington Palace. Since the coronation in 2023, Camilla's children and siblings had been granted unprecedented access. They used the grounds for private holidays and hosted shooting parties. William saw it as a risk to public trust and a betrayal of the streamlined monarchy he was trying to build. Camilla accused William of harboring a grudge to push her family out. William responded that non-working, non-lineage guests were a liability to the crown. He turned back to his father with a final condition. If these terms were not accepted and enforced in writing by morning, William would withdraw his family from all joint public appearances for the rest of the year. He would focus exclusively on his work in Wales and the Duchy of Cornwall, leaving the king to explain the sudden absence of the monarchy's 3 most popular young royals. Charles knew losing William and Catherine's visible support would be catastrophic. He reached for his fountain pen and pulled a notepad toward him. He began writing out the security directives. Camilla watched her husband yield, then turned and slammed the door behind her. At 6 o'clock the following morning, an updated access log hit the security terminal at Balmoral's gate. 5 names were deleted. At 7:15, a dark green Range Rover loaded several suitcases at the guest lodge. The guest who had spoken to Louis stepped into the vehicle, accompanied by a senior liaison officer. The car drove down the gravel driveway and passed through the iron gates toward Aberdeen. Over the next 48 hours, the purge expanded beyond Balmoral. Administrative staff at Clarence House received notices reclassifying private suites into official working quarters. In London, security teams reviewed access passes for Buckingham Palace and Highgrove House, stripping non-working relatives of master key cards. On their final afternoon in Scotland, William walked near the River Dee. Beside him was Prince Louis, happily pointing at salmon with a newly carved stick. William had not waited to inherit the crown to establish the boundaries of his reign. When a direct threat to his children's emotional well-being appeared, he executed a swift exercise of power that forced even the reigning monarch to yield. As the royal convoy prepared to leave Balmoral, Louis ran ahead to the lead car, laughing as he raced Princess Charlotte. The tears from earlier were forgotten. Prince William watched his children closely, adjusted his coat, and stepped into the vehicle. The future king had made his position clear, and the monarchy would never be the same again. The unspoken rules, broken at royal estate gates. A black security sedan pulled up to the guardhouse at Gatcombe Park early on a Tuesday morning. The driver rolled down the window and tapped an electronic clearance badge against the sensor. A red light flashed twice. A loud chime sounded inside the guard box. The security officer stepped outside, clipboard in hand. He looked at the driver, then checked the passenger list on his terminal screen. The guest inside the vehicle was a longtime personal acquaintance of Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter. For 3 years, that badge had granted instant access to royal grounds without question. Not anymore. The officer politely asked the driver to pull into the turning lane. He explained that all non-lineage access passes across senior estates had been suspended pending administrative review. 10 minutes later, the sedan turned around and headed back toward the main highway. Word spread through the family network within hours. The quiet eviction from Balmoral was not a temporary cooling-off period. It was the start of a systematic, nationwide administrative lockout. By early September, royal logistics officers were quietly re-evaluating long-standing arrangements at multiple crown properties. At Bagshot Park, security protocols were updated to restrict non-working family guests from accessing private equestrian facilities. Similar directives reached the administrative offices at St. James's Palace. For years, court insiders had accepted an unwritten rule regarding estate management. The monarch's spouse traditionally enjoyed broad discretion over household hospitality. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, private guests were hosted regularly across various lodges and cottages. However, those visits strictly adhered to traditional royal protocols. After 2024, those informal boundaries began to blur. Camilla's relatives had been granted access to estate amenities with minimal administrative oversight. Private cars were dispatched from official motor pools for non-official errands. Housekeeping staff at private residences were tasked with catering to large family parties that had zero connection to crown duties. Prince George and Princess Charlotte had previously noticed the shift during school holidays. Guest quarters usually reserved for official visiting dignitaries were frequently occupied by private parties. The atmosphere on the grounds had shifted from a quiet working estate to an open country club. William had remained patient during his father's early treatment phase. He wanted to avoid causing domestic stress while the king focused on his health. But the incident with Louis made it impossible to ignore the broader organizational issue. Allowing non-official guests to treat royal estates as personal property had created an environment where boundaries were completely forgotten. A specific administrative document was drawn up at Marlborough House by senior estate managers. It was called the Residence Access Charter. The draft sat on William's desk for 48 hours before being forwarded to the Lord Chamberlain. The charter introduced 3 strict operational rules. First, any non-working guest requesting access to sovereign property had to be sponsored directly by a working member of the royal family. Second, all security clearances for non-lineage visitors would expire after 48 hours, requiring fresh authorization for extended stays. Third, estate staff and crown transport could no longer be allocated for non-official personal events without prior approval from the duchy management team. Camilla tried to raise the issue during a private breakfast at Birkhall. She argued that the new rules were unnecessarily restrictive and openly targeted her children. She pointed out that her family had supported the king quietly for decades, without asking for public recognition or official roles. Charles listened, but he did not intervene. He had already signed the preliminary directive in his library. He knew that pushing back against William on estate governance would trigger a massive public rift that the monarchy could not afford. The immediate result was felt most sharply during preparations for the autumn shooting season. Traditionally, Camilla's son had hosted an annual gathering at Sandringham for close friends and business associates. The event had been a fixture on the estate calendar since 2025. 2 weeks before the scheduled date, the event coordinator received a formal memorandum from the estate office. The booking was canceled. The memorandum cited new scheduling priorities for working royals and updated land use protocols established by the Prince of Wales. The cancellation was a massive shock to Camilla's social circle. It proved that the security changes were not just about gate passes or driver clearances. William was actively dismantling the secondary court that had quietly formed around the Queen's family. Yet, as the new rules took effect across the country, a deeper question began circulating among household staff. How far was William willing to take this administrative overhaul? The answer came when estate managers received a new inquiry regarding the long-term lease arrangements for several private cottages on the grounds of Highgrove House. Those leases were up for renewal before the end of the year, and William held the final pen. The lease agreements that sealed the new reality. A thick manila folder rested on the glass desk inside the Duchy of Cornwall offices near Victoria Street. Inside were 3 commercial lease agreements for private cottages located along the northern perimeter of Highgrove. The signatures at the bottom were due for renewal before the end of October. For nearly 2 decades, those properties had been occupied under informal low-rent tenancy arrangements by close associates of the Queen. The original agreements were drawn up during the late 2000s when Charles personally managed the estate's residential portfolio. Rent was minimal. Maintenance costs were routinely absorbed by estate operational budgets. Prince William picked up a red fountain pen and reviewed the figures on the top sheet. As the Prince of Wales, William had assumed full legal control of the duchy land portfolio following the accession. That meant every lease, commercial contract, and residential tenancy fell directly under his fiduciary authority. While his father had treated Highgrove as a personal haven, William viewed the duchy strictly as a public trust that required rigorous fiscal management. On a cold Thursday afternoon, William met with the duchy's chief financial officer. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. William instructed the management team to align all residential tenancies with standard market rates. No exceptions were to be made for personal acquaintances or non-working relations. If current occupants chose not to meet the revised financial terms, the properties were to be listed on the open commercial market or repurposed for working estate staff. The notification letters were dispatched from London 48 hours later. When the news reached Camilla's private secretary, the reaction inside her office was immediate. The financial adjustment was not just an administrative tweak. It meant her extended family members faced a 4-fold increase in annual rent to remain on estate grounds. Camilla raised the issue directly with Charles during a weekend stay at Ray Mill House, her private country residence in Wiltshire. She argued that squeezing her relatives out of Highgrove was an unnecessary show of force that undermined the family's unity during a difficult health recovery period. Charles was caught in a difficult financial reality. The duchy was no longer his to manage. Legally, the king had zero authority to dictate rental terms or grant rent subsidies on duchy property. Pushing William to alter commercial contracts would invite severe scrutiny from internal auditors and public oversight bodies. By mid-2026, the first cottage was officially vacated. A moving van cleared out the residence on a rainy morning, dropping off keys at the main security gatehouse. The property was quickly assigned to a senior estate warden who had previously commuted over an hour to work each day. The lease enforcement proved that William's purge was not an emotional outburst tied solely to the garden incident at Balmoral. It was a calculated, permanent restructuring of how crown assets were utilized. Yet, as the physical footprint of Camilla's family shrank across royal properties, a new issue began to emerge inside the administrative corridors of Kensington Palace. Several high-profile autumn charity galas were scheduled to take place across central London. For years, non-working family members had occasionally represented the household at these high society functions, sitting at prominent tables near working royals. With the new protocols firmly in place, Event organizers received an updated protocol sheet directly from the Prince and Princess of Wales's private office. The document outlined strict seating arrangements and guest clearance rules for all upcoming official engagements. Non-working relatives were no longer permitted to sit within the official royal party or appear in formal arrival photographs distributed to news agencies. The move effectively drew a visible, public line between official working representatives of the Crown and private family members. During an annual charity dinner at Spencer House, the changes were put to the test. Members of Camilla's extended family arrived separately, entering through standard guest doors rather than the royal arrival courtyard. They were seated with general attendees, far from the main table occupied by senior royals. The message to the public and the media was absolute. The modern monarchy was operating as a streamlined, highly disciplined organization, where personal connections provided no special access or public prominence. Inside the palace, staff members noticed a distinct shift in daily operations. The constant turnover of informal visitors had ceased. Royal residences had returned to quiet, tightly controlled environments centered entirely on official duties and the immediate line of succession. Prince William had drawn a hard line around his family, his estates, and his future reign. The era of the secondary court was officially over, leaving a clear, unshakable boundary that no one inside the household would dare cross again. The red-drawn lines of sovereign authority. A dark blue sedan slowed to a stop outside the iron gates of Windsor Great Park. The driver lowered the window and handed an official visitor log to the duty officer. The officer scanned the names on his handheld digital tablet. He looked up, shook his head, and handed the document back. The vehicle contained 2 guests arriving for an afternoon tea gathering organized by Camilla's personal staff at Royal Lodge. In previous years, an informal phone call from a private secretary was enough to wave visitors through the gate. Not today. The duty officer pointed toward the public turning circle. He explained that all unscheduled visitor requests for non-working royals required written authorization from the Crown Estate Ranger's office 24 hours in advance. The sedan turned around and drove back down the long avenue. The incident was not a random administrative glitch. It was the direct result of a new policy document issued quietly by the Lord Chamberlain's office in July 2026. The directive, titled Revised Access and Governance Standards, applied to every Crown property across the United Kingdom. Inside Adelaide Cottage, Catherine sat at her dining table, reviewing the final summer schedule for her children. The atmosphere around their home was calm. The constant stream of external guests that used to pass through the nearby estate roads had disappeared entirely. The changes went far beyond security gates and estate access. In late 2025, Palace administrators had noticed an increase in private commercial inquiries linked to non-working family members. Several luxury brands had reached out to personal representatives of Camilla's adult children, seeking promotional tie-ins that referenced royal estate locations or historical connections. William stepped in before any agreements could be signed. He instructed the royal household legal team to issue strict trademark warnings regarding the commercial use of estate names, royal crests, and historical titles. The warning made it clear that any attempt to commercialize association with Crown properties would result in immediate legal action and permanent exclusion from all official royal events. The legal enforcement sent a clear signal to corporate sponsors and private brand agencies across London. The boundary between personal celebrity and official state duty was now enforced by corporate lawyers working directly for the duchy. During a private meeting at Clarence House, Camilla expressed her deep frustration to Charles. She pointed out that her children were independent private citizens who earned their own livings in journalism, food writing, and art curation. Restricting their ability to use family history or host guests on public land felt like an unfair penalty for simply being part of a blended family. Charles listened quietly, but his hands were tied. His medical advisors had urged him to reduce daily stress and avoid prolonged domestic disputes. More importantly, the king understood the political reality. Public scrutiny regarding state funding for royal security and estate maintenance was at an all-time high. Allowing extended non-working relatives to use state-funded assets for personal comfort was a major political risk. William was not just protecting his son's feelings, he was actively removing operational vulnerabilities that could damage the monarchy's public standing. By late summer, the new reality had settled over every royal residence. At Sandringham House, staff members followed a strict new roster for guest room allocations. Private suites that once hosted extended social gatherings were converted into secure administrative offices for visiting government officials and foreign diplomats. The shift was equally visible during the annual summer opening of Buckingham Palace. Visitors walking through the staterooms observed a tighter, more disciplined presentation of official history. The informal clutter of modern personal photographs in public reception rooms had been reorganized, focusing strictly on the direct line of succession. Yet, despite the tight operational control, a new question began to circulate among royal watchers and estate staff alike. With the autumn state visit season fast approaching, how would these rigid internal boundaries hold up when senior working royals and Camilla's family were forced to share the same physical space during large public events? The answer came during preparations for an international diplomatic reception, scheduled at St. George's Hall. The master of the household issued an updated protocol guide to all attending staff. The instructions were explicit. Non-working relatives were given dedicated private guest rooms in a separate wing of the castle, completely disconnected from the official reception rooms, where senior royals met foreign dignitaries. There would be no shared waiting areas, no overlapping transport arrangements, and no informal mingling before official photographs were taken. As the sun set over the stone towers of Windsor, Prince William walked across the quadrangle toward his car. He paused to watch Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte playing on the lawn near the private garden wall, surrounded by dedicated protection officers. The future king had drawn a firm, permanent line around his family and his estate. The era of loose boundaries, secondary courts, and informal privileges was over, replaced by an unyielding standard of duty that no one inside the household could ever challenge again. The protocol blueprint for a modern royal household. A heavy glass door clicked shut on the ground floor of St. James's Palace. Inside a quiet corner room, 3 estate managers sat around a dark oak table. A printed document, 20 pages long, lay open between them. The title page read, Master Framework for Household Operations and Public Engagement. It was stamped with the seal of the Duchy of Cornwall. The document laid out the exact operational standards for every royal property in Great Britain. It was drafted under the direct oversight of the Prince of Wales during the spring of 2026. The first page established a fundamental distinction. It separated official working members of the royal family from private non-working relatives. It stated that public funds, official transport, state-owned guest suites, and estate security details were strictly reserved for individuals with active constitutional duties. For decades, royal residences had operated on a mix of formal policy and informal tradition. Extended family members often stayed in spare apartments for weeks at a time. They used palace staff for personal errands and hosted private dinners in historic rooms. That practice was now officially dead. Under the new rules, non-working relatives who wished to stay on sovereign land were treated as private guests. They had to submit formal requests 2 weeks in advance. They paid standard commercial rates for housekeeping services. They were restricted from accessing private working corridors, security control rooms, and administrative offices. The framework also targeted the use of official communications channels. In previous years, private staff working for extended family members occasionally issued press statements on official palace stationery. The new policy banned the practice entirely. All media inquiries regarding non-working relatives had to be handled by private PR firms at their own expense. The changes caused immediate friction during the planning of an autumn benefit gala at Kensington Palace. An external event manager tried to book the palace orangery for a private charity dinner hosted by an associate of Tom Parker Bowles. In previous years, the booking would have been processed in 24 hours with a substantial family discount. This time, the request hit a wall. The estate office rejected the booking, stating the space was reserved for official state functions and public access days. The organizer was told to look for commercial venues elsewhere in London. The rejection proved that the new framework was not just a theoretical guidelines document, it was an active daily operational policy enforced by estate administrators without exception. Inside the royal household, the shift created a noticeably leaner operation. At Windsor Castle, administrative staff reorganized the schedule for private tours and guest visits. Suites that used to sit empty between private family stays were repurposed for working archivists, security personnel, and visiting diplomatic staff. The financial impact was immediate. By streamlining estate usage and removing unapproved personal perks, the household reduced non-official operational costs across 3 major properties before the end of the quarter. Yet, as the physical household adjusted to the rigid new standards, attention shifted toward the upcoming public calendar. A major national service was scheduled to take place at Westminster Abbey before the end of the year. Historically, large family gatherings at the Abbey included a broad mix of working royals, distant cousins, and extended marital relatives sitting together in the front pews. Palace protocol officers faced a sensitive challenge. How would the new operational boundaries be reflected in the seating plan of one of the country's most visible public events? The answer was delivered in a crisp, sealed envelope sent to the Abbey Marshal's office 2 weeks before the service. The seating plan was completely overhauled. The front 3 rows were strictly reserved for the King, the Queen, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and their 3 children. Extended family members, regardless of personal ties to the monarch, were assigned seats 4 rows back, behind the official diplomatic corps. When the day of the service arrived, the visual difference was stark. The cameras focused entirely on the direct line of succession. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis sat calmly alongside their parents in the lead pew. There were no side distractions, no informal interactions with non-working guests, and no ambiguity about who represented the future of the institution. As the congregation filed out of the Abbey onto the cold pavement, Prince William walked beside his eldest son, offering a quiet word of encouragement. The new blueprint was fully operational. The boundaries were drawn, the standards were set, and the modern royal household had officially entered a new era of discipline and purpose. What began as a quiet incident by a garden fountain at Balmoral transformed into a permanent shift in the British monarchy. Prince William drew an unshakable line, proving that protecting his family and safeguarding the line of succession come before a court politics. The secondary court is gone, the rules are rewritten, and the future of the crown rests firmly in disciplined hands. How do you feel about William's decisive moves to protect his family and streamline the household? Do you think these strict new rules will strengthen the monarchy's future?